right, let's go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll have more people joining us as it's just now 6 o'clock. I'm Laurie Benson. I'm chair of the First-Plymouth Congregational Church Climate Action Team, and we welcome you all this evening. I want to mention that the Climate Action Team has a web page on the First-Plymouth website. And if you're looking for more information, say like a basic talk on climate change science, you can find that on our web page, along with some other videos from earlier this year on a variety of topics. I'll leave those to you to explore. Tonight we have the first speaker in a two-part series on energy that we are calling cleverly Energize. I'll mention our second speaker coming up on June 17th will be Mark Skolnick with Lincoln Electric System. And Mark's going to address the question, or those of us who say, gosh, I'd like to do something to lower my carbon footprint. I'd like to maybe save some money at the same time, but I'm not sure, I don't know where to get started. I know how to buy an energy efficient appliance, but what do I do if I want to put solar panels on my roof? That sort of thing. So, and what gets me the most for my investment? And so Mark has a fun, interactive game show type game to answer those questions. If you have a smartphone, it's also interactive. You can play along at home. So on June 17th at 6 o'clock, we hope you'll join us with your smartphone in hand if you'd like for Mark's presentation. But before we get to that individual level look at energy, we're going to take a more global look at energy with this evening's speaker, Dr. Michael Wysession, who is joining us from St. Louis. He is a professor of geophysics at Washington University in St. Louis, and he is a leader in geophysics as well as geoscience literacy and education. He's pioneered methods for using the energy of seismic waves from earthquakes to make 3D visualizations of Earth's interior structure. Michael has authored or co-authored over 100 papers and reports in these areas, as well as over 35 science textbooks ranging from grade school to graduate school. Michael was chair of the National Science Foundation's Earth Science Literacy Initiative and chair of Earth and Space Science for both the U.S. National Academy of Science report, a framework for K through 12 science education, and next generation science standards, which form the basis for K through 12 science standards in 45 states, including Nebraska. Michael has authored 4 video lecture courses with the teaching company Great Courses series, watched by millions of people, including the science of energy, which is how I happened to learn of Michael. I stumbled across this in the library, and I recommend that to you. It's a fabulous set of lectures from 2016. So there'll be a little bit of update to that, I think. And also one that Carolyn Zeiser mentioned to me called, that I've not seen, The World's Greatest Geological Wonders, 36 Spectacular Sites. Michael has received multiple awards for his science and education work, including the 5-year David and Lucille Packard Foundation's Science and Engineering Fellowship and the National Science Foundation's 5-year Presidential Faculty Fellowship, awarded at the White House. Michael also serves as Washington University's Executive Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning, coordinating pedagogical professional development for the university's faculty members. So here's my summary of Dr. Wysession's credentials. He is a for real big deal scientist who also has a wonderful ability to translate science for those of us who are not scientists. So with that introduction, Dr. Wysession, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. As Laurie mentioned to you, I'm a geophysicist, but I am really dedicated to education and geoscience literacy. I actually began my career teaching high school physics and math in a high school in New York City. have stayed involved with K-12 education throughout my time as a research scientist, and because I think it's there's just nothing more important. Now I so much of my work now is involved with doing whatever I can to sort of increase understanding of how our amazing planet works. And I view very much the energy in that vein as well. Laurie mentioned a global approach. I'm actually going to take a more state level, regional approach. I will try to talk largely in the context of things that are going on in your state of Nebraska. Here is a graph that shows Nebraska's energy sources from 2001, which is over on this side here, all the way to 2019. And you can notice an interesting trend, and that is if you go back just 20 years ago, coal was 2/3 of the energy for Nebraska's electricity. That number has dropped, and what has risen is wind, which is actually, as I'll show in a moment, is now more than 20%. Here is a graph that shows the last, well, actually, it's all of 2020 and the first 2 months of 2021, and you could see coal is still sort of the dominant source. But wind is now, during this last period, and this is the most recent that we have data available through the government's, it's a wonderful website, the Energy Information Association that the US government has, is now up to 23%. The purple here is nuclear, and so you'll notice it is fairly constant. It dropped off at one point, and this is something that does have to occur with nuclear. Sometimes you do need to shut it entirely down in order to change fuel rods. There is only one nuclear reactor now providing power up until 2013, actually until 2011. Nebraska had two, but the Fort Calhoun site has been shut down. I'll talk about that in a little bit later. But you notice that the wind is variable. You notice the coal is variable as well, but it is also largely tracking the demand. The black curve here is the total. And so most of that has been still tracked largely by coal, but other sources are picking up the slack. Now, I will say, if you go to your neighbors, you see something quite different. So here's Iowa, and you see Iowa was 85% coal back 20 years ago, and coal is now a third. And what has now taken almost, in fact, it's a little bit more than this, almost half, is wind power. And the variability of wind has largely been picked up by an increase in natural gas. Here's Kansas. Kansas, again, 71% coal back 20 years ago, and now wind is the number one source. Coal is now down to actually less than a third. So you notice a trend occurring, and of course, this is not accidental. This is a map that shows average wind speed at a height of 80 meters, and there's a reason for this. The ground with trees and topography actually provides some friction for the wind and drag, and the wind is slower along the ground, but by the time you get to about 80 meters in height, the wind is fairly constant at that point up for a while. And that's why there has been a trend for wind turbines to be much larger. Their average hub height is now above 80 meters in order to tap into this higher constant speeds. But, if you look at Nebraska here, it's pretty much all purple. And this is between 8 and 9 meters per second. So this is pretty fast. We're looking at about 30 feet per second. And so you see this whole band here across the Midwest, from Mexico all the way down up to Canada, just east of the Rockies. And other than offshore, which also has very strong wind. This is the best wind resources in the country. And this is important, in talking about renewable sun-based energy systems, which largely are, come in four flavors. You have direct solar, so solar photovoltaic. You have wind, which is driven by pressure differences because of the sun's heating. Hydrologic, which is from the water cycle, which is also driven by the sun causing evaporation on the ocean surfaces, and biomass, which obviously is from photosynthesis. And it is fortunate that these are, they're not all the same strength everywhere or availability, but everywhere has something. The Southwest does not have the water resources and does not have good wind resources, but it has great direct solar. The Southeast has really neither, but it has very good, both biomass and water resources. Now, why does this happen? Well, if you look at this picture of this tire on this slope, I believe there's actually a person in there, crazy as it seems. You know what's going to happen next. That wheel is going to fall downhill. And that's exactly what happens across the Great Plains. Basically, the air flows downhill from the Rockies all the way to the Mississippi River Valley. And Nebraska, as you can see, is a fairly large portion of the total profile from San Francisco to New York City. And it's downhill pretty much all the way, and it doesn't take much of a slope to allow wind to pick up speed. And so this going to be this constant supply of wind flowing across the Great Plains. If you look at 2019 electricity generation, you can see that, that even though actually Texas has enormous wind production, it's also the case that the Texas just requires so much energy that the wind is only 16%. But it's still an enormous amount. But you look at the rest of these states here, and you can see very large percentages of electricity generation is now coming from wind. And notice that Nebraska is a little bit behind. And basically what this means is there are large untapped wind resources. It is projected that the total US wind is on the order of 10 terabytes. Which is far more than, the total US energy consumption in all forms is about, sorry, I meant terawatts, is about 3 terawatts. And the total wind is at least 10 terawatts. Why? Okay, so I've talked about why the wind exists. Why is it being tapped into and fairly rapidly? And of course, that is a function of money. And if you look at, now this is a couple years old and it's already changed. If you look at something called the levelized cost of energy, the LCOE, and you know what, maybe I should jump to the definition of that. This is the per kilowatt hour, so dollars per kilowatt hour in discounted real dollars, of building and operating a generating plant over an assumed financial life and cycle. This includes everything that goes into it: the costs of building it, the capital costs, your fuel costs, your operations and management costs, financing, everything over the lifetime of the plant. And it's variable depending on where it's built and resource availability. But if you look at all of these, the least expensive now, $29, and that was a 2019 in the US, per megawatt hour is wind power. Considerably less than even the cheapest coal, even cheaper than combined cycle natural gas. Nuclear begins out here. At this point, sort of industrial level solar is getting close. It's still marginally more. Rooftop solar, which doesn't have the advantage of sort of large size, is more quite a bit more expensive, but still cost effective, as I'll mention in a moment. But wind here is taking off because of the cost. And it's important that this doesn't even take into account the health and environmental consequences of sources that require fuel. So this actually favors the fossil fuels, because multiple studies have shown that, for instance, the use of coal, if you include the health costs and environmental costs, like direct impacts on agriculture, that triples the cost of coal. So now you're taking coal, from $60, and you're taking, you're going out here with it. And this is why the coal industry has been collapsing, despite many efforts to subsidize and bolster it. It just cannot compete in a free market economy on a financial level. If you look at that change in time, now solar is the most dramatic. If you go back a little more than a decade, here's solar power, here's the levelized cost of energy, dollars per megawatt hour, going from 300 down to 40. And so solar has been taking off as well. But here's wind. It still has gone down considerably from a minimum of $100 down to less than 30. There's nothing miraculous about this. It is a well-known sort of industrial phenomenon that it's not really a law, but it's given a law called Swansons Law. And that is, the more you build of something, the cheaper it gets. So this is a plot that shows the cost per module, and this is in 2015 dollars, compared to the total number of shipments. And this is for photovoltaic cells. And you can see that there is this line, there's a logarithmic plot. So this is going up, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million. And the cost also is going up $1, $10, $100. But you can see this steady drop in the cost as you make more of it. And I will say, this is my backyard. I have 12 solar panels on my garage. And then I also have another 12 on the roof of my home. And I paid no electricity the last couple of months. This is enough to supply all the electricity that I need during the springtime. During, when I'm running the forced air heating in the winter and the air conditioning in the summer, I covered a half to a third of my costs. But basically, this will pay for itself in 7 years, even though, as I showed, the cost is much less effective than industrial size wind and solar. And so, not surprisingly, as that cost of wind came down, and this is in terms of cost per kilowatt hour, the use has gone up and continues to grow dramatically quickly. Now, there are places that look like this. This is the mountains of the Mojave Desert in California. This is the largest wind farm in the United States. But increasingly in the Midwest, this is what you see. And there's some really nice things about this. First of all, it's quite common for homeowners to lease this to a power company for some thousands of dollars per turbine. And so there's a steady income for the landowner, the farmer. It can also be put in amidst crops with a minimum impact on land use. And it can also go into grazing lands, again, with a minimum amount of land that it takes up. And so this is an advantage over, let's say, putting in a dam where you have to flood a whole valley. Or even solar farms where you have to cover a large area with solar panels. You can multi-purpose the land quite easily here. Here's a map. This is a couple of years old that shows the locations of wind farms in the continental U.S. I will say it's too bad that Hawaii isn't included on this, because Hawaii has the nation's most expensive energy costs, because any oil or gas has to be imported by tanker ship. So there's a very strong move towards to solar and wind in Hawaii. But again, you can see the large Midwest wind belt here is where most of those wind farms are going in. But it's also important to notice that there's a strong sort of national interest, because the Southeast, even though it doesn't have a strong wind resources, is where the majority of our wind turbines are generated. So it's creating a lot of jobs. There are over 120,000 full-time, high-paying jobs in the wind industry in the United States now, compared to less than 50,000 in the coal industry, for example. So this is now not only sort of great economic benefit, it's providing jobs, an increasing number of high quality, good paying jobs. Now the US is adopting wind at a moderate rate. This is in terms of added wind capacity in 2018, but you'll notice far ahead is China. This is what they've added in 2018, and this is cumulative. And you can see China is really the sort of leading the pack in both. China is also leading in hydrologic, in photovoltaic, in coal, and at the top, or if not entirely at the top, in nuclear as well. So China is preparing for an enormous expansion of its economy, there are advantages to being the first country to move into something. And so there is a certain impetus for the United States to move more quickly into developing wind and solar, because other countries are quickly coming on board on this. And if you develop the technology, then other countries come to you for it. So rather than us sort of buying, cheap solar panels from China, for example, which was an issue a few years back, it would be better, from my perspective as an American, if America was leading the technology on this. It would be benefit to our nation, to our economy. Here is a map of U.S. electricity generation from both wind, which is in blue, and solar, which is in orange and yellow, or what is this, tan, two shades of tan. I'm not sure what you would call these colors. And there are a couple of things to notice here. First of all, there's a variability that occurs. And you'll notice that the solar is peaking, not surprisingly, in the summers. You'll notice that the wind is peaking in the winter, and it actually drops off in the summer. And there is therefore sort of an advantage to combining wind and solar, because the maximum solar resources are obviously when the days are longer in the summer. But the winds are stronger often in the fall and early winter, and they become weaker during the summertime. So there are advantages to combining both of these. Now, one thing that is very true for any new technology, but is definitely true for wind and solar, and less so for things like natural gas and coal-fired plants, and that is, early on in the technology, there is significant growth in efficiency. So this is photovoltaic cell efficiencies up through 2020, starting in 1975. And this cell efficiency is a little bit different than the efficiency that you would see, let's say, for a coal or nuclear power plant, which is how much of the heat generated are you actually capturing and converting into electricity. This is how much of the sunlight are you capturing? There's no downside to not using sunlight. The fuel is free. I mean, if you're having to dig up coal or uranium, there is a problem with wasting it because you have to dig up more of it. It's expensive, that process of mining and transporting fuels. The wind and sun are free. But nonetheless, you want to be able to take advantage as much as you can. And you can see that multi-junction cells, and what this means is they have multiple different materials. So you're capturing different parts of the sun's spectrum, right? You know that sunlight goes from high frequency ultraviolet, that's what gives you, causes sunburn, to low frequency infrared, and it's peaked in the visible spectrum, red through blue. Well, different minerals will be able to use the photoelectric effect to convert certain parts of that spectrum, but not all. And so you can see now we're up to 47%. So we're up to using, being able to capture almost half of the sunlight and convert that directly into electricity. Now, this is really expensive. If you have a NASA satellite and you have a limited amount of space on your satellite, you're going to use this sort of material. For commercial, solar panels, though, we're easily up into the 20s now. So you're getting a quarter, and that's really good. And it's one of the most interesting areas are some of these organic cells. That's the triangles. They're plastic. They're flexible. You can put them on your clothing, your backpack. You can roll them up. They're totally non-toxic. They are cheap to produce, and that's an area of as you see, really important recent growth. Let me come back to this topic, though, of the variability of wind and solar. And in particular, so this is all U.S. wind production, 2011 through 2017, averaged out. And you can see during the summer, you reach a low of about 22%, and you get up to about 45%. And the capacity factor means what percentage of the possible wind that you could get from a turbine are you actually converting into electricity? And obviously for, this is the national average. For any given turbine, it's going to go up and down. Well, you have to find a way to do this because I know I'm certainly not going to be happy if somebody tells me you might not be able to watch that baseball game because the wind might not be blowing. And so you might just have to, turn on a battery operated radio or something. We're spoiled. We're used to continuous energy. And if you are looking at continuous energy at about a 99+% level, you need to get storage costs down to about $100 a kilowatt hour. And basically that means however you're producing your energy, you want to send some of it off into storage so that when it's nighttime and the solar panels aren't working, or it's calm and the wind turbines aren't generating, you are still able to provide energy to houses and factories. So how do we do that? Currently, most of the world's stored energy is through pumped hydrologic storage. Basically, you pump water uphill. And this is on the level of about 180 approaching 200 gigawatts. And you see 93% is pumped hydro. Everything else is much small. CAES is compressed air. There's one place in Alabama where there's a big pump that compresses air, takes excess energy, squeezes the air underground in a giant mine cavity, And then when they need that energy back, the air flows back through, runs the turbines, and they get electricity. However, that's only about 30% efficient. You lose 70% of your energy. Molten salt is much more efficient, but it's more expensive. But there are types of solar power called concentrated solar. Here you use the energy from the sun to heat salt so it's molten, and you use that to boil water and run your turbine, and that stays hot overnight. For very rare circumstances, particularly where a power company wants to maintain energy at a certain frequency, they actually use giant flywheels, which are massive iron cylinders that spin hundreds of times a minute and store energy. But the rest is batteries, electrochemical. And of those, most of them are lithium ion batteries. That's what's used in electric cars now. And so, but there are other types of batteries. Flow batteries are an interesting area of growth. That's where you actually have often molten metals, and they act as rechargeable batteries, much more efficient than solid cell rechargeable batteries. But this is a huge area of growth, the lithium ion batteries. All right. I think this graph actually just sort of says what I just talked about. I will say there's a big difference between what we're commonly deploying now: pumped hydro, compressed air, batteries, and flywheels. Things that we are on the verge of commercially using, particularly these metal flow batteries, superconducting magnetic materials, and capacitors, and ones that we are early in. Adiabatic compressed air means it's so well insulated that you don't lose all this energy to heat. Hydrogen is important. That is taking water and using energy to split it into its hydrogen and oxygen. That hydrogen then could be used in hydrogen fuel cells. So there are some car companies, for example, that are heavily investing in hydrogen fuel cell technology. And then also synthetic natural gas. And this is where you take energy to convert carbon dioxide into methane, which then can be used as a fuel. This also is a little bit more expensive, but it has great potential for being a way of dealing with all the extra carbon dioxide that is impacting climate. Pumped hydro is from a physics standpoint, the simplest. You literally just take water, you pump it uphill when you have excess energy. And now you have a reservoir up here. And when you need that energy back, it flows back down through those penstocks, and it runs your turbines. And you see all the power lines here, and they're going two directions. The excess electricity comes in, pumps the water uphill, and then when you need it back, the water comes down, runs the turbines, and now you generate electricity, and you send that off. And this graph shows exactly the same thing. One of the largest actually is in Virginia. This is the large one in Michigan, off of Lake Michigan. And you can see you don't need a lot of elevation to do this. Here's Lake Michigan here. Here's a very large reservoir. And there are a set of pumps in here that pump that water up into it when there's excess energy. Who's doing this? This is largely on the coasts or Colorado, places with topography. So Appalachia, it uses this. You got a lot of mountainous, hilly areas. Harder in flatter areas in the Midwest. Actually, we have a large one in Missouri, not far from my home. It's the tallest point in Missouri, and we've built a lake at the top of it, and we store energy up at the top of Tomsock Mountain. An interesting area of growth that can happen anywhere, however, is doing the gravitational storage downward. So here you have a large weight. In this case, it's a set of sort of drums that are lowering this weight on a set of cables. There's another company that uses water Basically, when you have excess energy, it runs a pump that pumps water down, and that pushes this weight upward. And then to get it back, you let the weight fall down. That drives the water up through the pipe, back through the turbine, and then you generate your electricity from there. You don't need any topography to do this. You just dig out a hole underground. There are multiple factors involved with storage. It's not just the size. So this is sort of, megawatts, 1 megawatt, 10 megawatt, 100 megawatt. A gigawatt is a typical large power plant. And right now, only pumped hydro and compressed air storage can handle that bulk level. It's also the rate at which it can occur. So flywheels, as I mentioned, are used often on a matter of seconds to maintain the sort of cycles per second of our AC electric current. But you may have a power outage. You may need hours or days of storage. And so you need size as well. I mentioned the cost is really important. And here are current lithium battery storage costs. And this is, again, a couple years old. And I will say this is a really rapidly changing technology. We have whole research groups at my university alone that are constantly publishing new results in the area of battery technology. This obviously becomes cheaper for larger scale, longer hour. But for a 4-hour battery storage, we're now down to about $300 per kilowatt hour. And basically, economists will tell you when you break below about 100, then this will take off and becomes economically feasible to store energy. I mentioned here, the goal is to get down to $100 per kilowatt hour. These are moving down. Here show some of the storage technologies. And again, here's that same sort of Swansons Law. Here's the price. This is in dollars per kilowatt hour. And this is in installed capacity. And you can see for electrolysis, for fuel cells, we're now, as of 2014, so this is old, almost a decade old. We were under $200. There is a chance that hydrogen fuel cells might win out in the end over electric battery cars because of their cost. I will say hydrogen fuel cells are less efficient than batteries, but if that price continues to drop, then that storage mechanism will end up winning out, even though it's only about half as efficient. Here you can see lead acid batteries not really changing. So this is an example of a technology that we know how lead batteries work. We're not gaining a lot with it. Here's the lithium ion though. And you can see there's a pretty steep downward curve. This point is 2011. And so, as I said, it's already getting cheaper. We need it to get down to about here. And then we'll be able to do this. When do economists think this will happen? Well, there are lots of factors involved. But if here's what we're looking for, $100 per kilowatt hour of storage, this triangle here, this is the lithium ion batteries. So we're looking at maybe 2040 here. So that's for electronic costs. Lithium ion for electric vehicles, that looks like maybe 2035 or so. So obviously with subsidies, it's going to happen sooner than that, but without any subsidies at all, just letting the free market economy take hold of it, we're looking at less than 2 decades now. And so this is really exciting. Now, there's another interesting aspect to this, and that is whether you do the storage at the company production side, that's called grid scale storage, or whether you do it what's called behind the meter at the user end. And initially the growth was in sort of grid scale storage, large scale storage, but the growth has been on the personal level. These are basically batteries that you can buy and then put in your garage. There is another whole new area of discussion, and that's electric vehicles themselves. There are already sort of pricing models like in Australia where you get a huge benefit if you use electricity at cheaper hours. So let's say you set your dishwasher to run, and then when the price of electricity drops at 3 a.m., because nobody's using it much at that hour, then your dishwasher goes on and you pay a cheaper price for that electricity. Well, basically, the entire US could provide all of its storage with a full global fleet of electric vehicles. Basically, you would make money by not driving your car in the middle of the night, let's say, which most people don't anyway, and then your car is then powering back the grid or what's needed. And then during the daytime, when solar panels, for example, are going, you're charging your car back up. All sorts of models are being discussed, but basically, there are some car companies like GM that will not be making combustion engine cars soon. They've already committed fully to electric cars. Whether that is battery powered or hydrogen fuel cell powered still waits to be seen, or maybe a combination of both. But this is a whole new world of how we handle this. Another way to deal with this is using a smart transmission grid. This is our current electric grid, and it's not very good. It's old. It's not very smart. It's not very connected. You can see there it operates at different kilovoltage levels, and if we really want to take advantage of Nebraska farmers having wind turbines on their land, or landowners in Texas in the desert putting in solar panels, or South Dakota, which is largely powered by hydro. If we want to move to that world, we need a better grid. And in terms of discussion of infrastructure that's happening in the government now, both in the president's proposal and in negotiations on both sides of Congress, this transmission grid figures prominently, because just in the way sort of the national interstate highway system was an incredible boon to our national economy, being able to move goods around from one state to another. And then the internet sort of highway was the next large sort of interstate highway system, basically, that was an incredible benefit to our global and national economies. So will our national transmission grid be the next highway system that will allow for tremendous financial growth and gain. All right, I'm almost out of time. I have just a couple quick things about sort of climate and temperature, but you have other climates, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. I will say I looked up the average annual Nebraska temperature change since 1950, and it's gone up 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And of course it fluctuates. So this is really important. The total increase of 2 degrees is much less than the total variability year to year, but nonetheless, that is a significant noticeable change. Fortunately, we don't have to guess anymore about temperature and precipitation and other climate data. We don't have to worry about sort of heat centers in urban areas. We now have NASA satellites, and we've had them for 40 years, a whole fleet of satellites that are constantly monitoring gas composition, humidity, temperature, ice levels, ocean levels, around the globe. So we now know exactly what our planet is doing, thanks to NASA. I don't think this gets enough credit. We always hear about the amazing discoveries on Mars and other planets, but NASA provides us incredible, reliable, consistent information about our own planet. And it's vital. This is a large reason why weather forecasts have gotten so much better over the course of our lifetimes, because we have constant measurements across the globe. And I will say those same computer programs are what we use for forecasting climate into the future. And they also have gotten considerably better over time. So, we now know what the temperature has been doing, and we know how this correlates directly with the greenhouse gases. And we're able to look at the contributions of ozone, the sun, volcanoes, land clearing, pollution, which actually has helped global temperatures. And if you put all those factors together, that's the gray line. The dots are the actual observed temperatures. And you cannot explain the increase in global temperatures without taking into account the greenhouse gases. This isn't anything new. We've known this for over 100 years. If you look back even over the last 100,000 years, from ice cores, global temperatures and carbon dioxide levels track each other. They also track each other over hundreds of millions of years as well, and at the level of years. What are the implications for Nebraska? This is a forecast model. Again, it's similar to what is used to forecast weather, but it's looking at longer time scales. And we're looking at, for North America, an increase in flooding for almost the entire continent. And this is in not the total amount of water, but in the number of 5-day precipitation events, severe weather events. What's interesting is much of North America is also going to have more droughts. Basically, the rain is coming in smaller, intense packets. Nebraska's kind of right in between. The projections are that the total amount of droughts will not be considerably increased. We'll considerably have more flooding. For 48 US states, you can really see that trend again from 1960 onward. Basically a doubling of the area that has been subject to these one-day extreme precipitation events. It is the most single significant change in sort of climate, global weather and climate patterns. Nebraska is very interesting, though. If you look at this, I made this picture. This is the entire continental US Mississippi River watershed. So this is all the rain that falls within this red area, and some of Canada, which isn't, unfortunately, the USGS doesn't provide that. All makes its way and flows out into the Gulf through New Orleans. Look at this area here, though. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm using a red pen. Maybe I should change the color here. Let's go to blue here. Let's look at this region here. That is Nebraska. There are significant portions of Nebraska that have no stream systems, where the rain that falls does not make it into a river. And the large reason, if you notice these topographic features, these are sand dunes. Here's a photo from the sandhills. Much of Nebraska is technically desert. And at various times has been rolling sand dunes that have now a thin cover of vegetation. Much of Nebraska is green now. That's often because water from the Ogallala aquifer is pumped out and used. Now, the good news is, with the current trend is, as I said, Nebraska's sort of on the verge. But if you look at the last decade, there has been in general a slight increase in precipitation. Now, temperature pretty much everywhere in the US, as I said, is dramatically going up. The one exception is some of these upper west states, just because there's so much precipitation, it has actually caused a cooling of that area. But you see a real division here. The dry west is getting drier. The moist east of the Rockies is getting moister. Essentially, the rich are getting richer with water, the poor are getting poorer. This area is facing some significant stress from drought, and to go along with it, forest fires. Now, I mentioned the Ogallala Aquifer. Nebraska is a huge user of the water in there. Wonderful resource. And fortunately, Nebraska is also one of the few areas where the Ogallala is not dramatically dropping. There are some places where it is dropping, but for the most part, some of this is due to water that is making it into the aquifer down along the Platte River, and it is due to some of the increase in precipitation. In most parts of the Ogallala, however, rain in the Midwest is not able to recharge the aquifer. And that's because these are broad artesian systems that are due to warped hydropermeable beds that actually are exposed at the edge of the Rockies. So it's actually rainfall in the Rockies that works its way down deep underground, coming underneath Nebraska, and then can be tapped into it. Fortunately, there are some places in Nebraska where some of that rainwater is able to seep in. But for the most part, this is fossil water. This is water that formed in, made it into the Ogallala way back out west at the end of the wet last melting of the ice during the last ice age, tens of thousands of years ago. And the last thing I'll mention is the flooding that's happening has some direct consequences on energy in other ways. Here's the Fort Calhoun nuclear station in the year 2011, entirely flooded out, knocked offline for a couple of years by flooding along the Missouri River. Obviously, it was designed to withstand any floods expected along the Missouri River. This was not expected. And with the increased flooding we're seeing in the upper Midwest, we can expect to see more of this. One problem with large fueled power plants, either coal or natural gas or nuclear, is you need a body of water in order to cool off your gas, your water, your fluid. And so you need that access to cooling. And this went back online, but then was permanently removed. And so there's just one power plant, a nuclear power plant for Nebraska currently. And the last thing I'll just say, another thing that is sort of dramatic that we are seeing and its impact on biomass energy, which I didn't say anything at all about, and that is the very rapid northward shift of plant hardiness. The growing season is changing, and this is changing the types of vegetation, the type of plants. And there are climate scientists who are now trying to use satellite data to look at what crops actually can or should be grown as whole growing zones are moving. Basically, zone 6 has already entirely moved out of my state of Missouri, and zone 7 is on its way, moving across it as well. I will stop there. I'll end my share, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Wysession. That was absolutely fascinating. Let's see here. I can't get there we go. There's my camera back on. If you have a quick question and want to pop it in the chat, that would be great. Otherwise, I've got several things, and we don't have a lot of time because we didn't want to keep this to an hour. But as you're aware, Nebraska's got a lot invested in ethanol, as do many other states in the Midwest and Great Plains. Can you just comment on what you see as the future there, or maybe some pros and cons?
Yeah, I think it's people are going to look back and look at burning coal and natural gas as like taking the family Chippendale furniture and chopping it up and throwing it in the fireplace, because it is so needed for industry. Coal is used for smelting metals. Petroleum, that's what all our pharmaceuticals, our plastics, our fertilizers are made from. And so when we run out of this, we're going to need those biofuels to supply basically our world's industry of plastics and synthetics and isomers and polymers. So right now, a lot of it is used for biofuels, but that will transition as we continue to run lower on petroleum. That will supply our chemical feedstocks for the chemical industries. And so hold on to that because that is going to be really valuable stuff. And there are some things, we're not going to fly an airplane on batteries. We're gonna need jet fuels, and it's going to come from biofuels.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So this is maybe the same answer, or maybe for you it's two different answers. But when you look at our energy future, what gives you the most hope, and what do you find the most fascinating thing that you're seeing develop?
We receive as much sunlight in 80 minutes as all humans currently use in a year. So we have just begun to tap into solar resources, and it's continuous, and it's free. And so, there are many areas of concern globally. Mineral resources are a kind of sticky matter where we're running short of some, but energy, sunlight, that's forever. And so, the transition will be hard. We ran for hundreds of thousands of years on sunlight, basically muscle, food, biomass, and our own strength and oxen plowing fields. And then we had this fossil fuel. From a geologist perspective, it's like a blip in time, the fossil blip. It's a couple centuries, or maybe even 1,000 years. But then when the fossil fuels are done, we go back to using solar, and it's limitless. And you know what? We also don't have to go to a desert in the Mideast and fight over sunlight. And the majority of the wars of the last 50 years, the tensions that exist there now, are only because a few countries in the Mideast hold most of the world's, petroleum supplies. Once we go to sunlight, all of that is done because we have as much sunlight as anybody else. We don't have to go to somewhere to fight for it. So I think the world will become a more peaceful place, a more cooperative place once we move out, into tapping into that solar power.
Very good. So somebody's asked a question about lithium batteries, and that's always a concern, is disposing of those, and once they're no longer usable and so forth. How do we think about the end cycle, the end use of some of these things? And then kind of the same thing I'll say with one of the things that opponents of wind talk about is, well, you've got no way to dispose of turbines, and especially the blades when we're done.
Yeah. So it's like any other resource where when it's cheaper to dig it up new, that's what happens. And that's the only reason why we don't recycle lithium batteries, is that it's currently cheaper. The resources are still fairly abundant. But we need to be saving those stores of oxidized used lithium batteries, because at some point, not far off in the future, it will be economically feasible and sensible to recycle those lithium batteries. And the steel of wind turbines, right now, raw steel is fairly inexpensive, but frankly, it's a whole heck of a lot easier to recycle a broken wind turbine blade than it is to go dig it up out of the ground, smelt it, transport it, all that work. Those cost difference margins are not very large. And so fairly soon in the future, those will be cost efficient, and then we'll be recycling that as well.
Very good. So what about something that I've read about that's, well, tell me, is there anything that fascinates you that you see as emerging that you think that's interesting? What has made you say that recently?
I am really impressed by the small modular sort of level 4 nuclear plants. I'm a physicist by training. I do think that nuclear power still has a role. The energy density is so enormous, and the newer generation of nuclear plants are safe, they are reliable, they are much less expensive. Imagine if everyone was still using a television set in their home that was invented 60 years ago. That's basically what we're doing with nuclear power. The first generation nuclear plants that came out, that's what everybody put in. And the industry has moved dramatically over that time, but it is not economically competitive with wind and solar. But it takes up much less land. So there may be a point in the future where our pressure for land becomes great enough that the nuclear will become available. As a physicist, we still hold out hope for nuclear fusion to occur. But as the joke is, it's 50 years off into the future and always will be. It's just we're not there yet. There are some serious enormous challenges to holding, million-degree magnetic plasma it contained in a small area. It's easy at the center of the sun because it's pressured on all sides. So that's what powers, the sun is nuclear fusion at its core. Doing it in a building is another matter. But if we could, that would be amazing. And there's some neat results that are coming in that area that give me some hope.
Very good. So one thing that I've read about is things like paints that would have photovoltaic cells in them, so that you can just coat everything with photovoltaic cells, cars and the outside the buildings, and windows now have transparent films that also collect some of it. Yes.
Is
that feasible?
It is indeed feasible. What's going to drive this is the economics of it. If we were in a dictatorship like Russia or China, we could just say, we're going to do this, or I'm going to cut your head off, or whatever, and it will happen. We don't operate that way. And so things have to make sense economically to be done. And so, right now, putting in a wind turbine, generates so much energy. And one thing that's really nice about electricity is it can be transported large distances with minimal loss. And this really helps. So you can have a turbine, you can have a city like Chicago that can be run off Nebraska turbines. And you don't lose that much electricity transporting it across. It's really cool, things like paints and surfaces that can generate electricity. I think that will be really helpful. I work a lot with NASA satellites. I've run this program for years where I've gone to the different NASA centers and run a 3-day workshop on the geology of the solar system for NASA engineers. They need every square inch. So if they can have a, a paint on their International Space Station that will help generate electricity, well, then they're going to do it. I don't know that will become economically viable, except for maybe a few sort of extreme circumstances. I was about to say someplace like, battleships or something, but they run off of nuclear power now, the big ones anyway. So
well, we'll make this the last question, but it's kind of a related question, one I've not seen asked before, is whether solar cells require any kind of rare minerals or materials, the kinds of things that are scarce, that there's competition for, that people go to war over, that it takes a lot of environmental damage, get them. I guess talk just briefly about that.
Sure. So it depends on what efficiency you demand. If you need more than 40% efficiency, so if you're, on a NASA satellite and you have to make every square inch count, yes, those tend to be more rare metals. Most of them run off things like silicon or perovskite that are very common. And I mentioned that we're now up to about 15% efficiency of organics cells. So these are plastics, plastic polymers. They are totally safe. You could eat them. I don't recommend it, but so but you're at 15% efficiency and not 45. But if you have space, to do that, then yes. So it really depends. And the same issue with the storage, by the way, some of those flow batteries that are being, experimented with involve vanadium or arsenic or some elements that are toxic and expensive and rare. You're not going to want to mass produce those. But there are ones that are, involving more sort of typical metals like zinc or something, and their efficiencies are maybe not quite as high, but the materials are cheaper and they are not toxic, and so this issue, exists throughout chemistry at all levels. The trade-off between, doing something at your highest efficiency, which often involves materials that, that could be toxic, or at a lower efficiency, but it's safe, it's plentiful. And so, all of these industries are subject to those same costs and benefits.
Very good. Well, I think we'll call it an evening there. Thank you so much, Dr. Wysession. An absolutely fascinating presentation. And it'll be fun to see in coming years how much our energy portfolio in Nebraska changes in line with the things that you've said. So thank you. And thanks everybody for attending. A reminder for the June 17th presentation by Mark Skolnick, 6 to 7 p.m. Thursday, June 17th. We'll see you all then. So thank you, everybody. Good evening.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.